My name is Nicholas Bamforth. I'm law tutor at Queen's College and the Associate Dean for Equality and Diversity in the Law Faculty. I'll be chairing today's event in that capacity. During this panel discussion today, we will be reflecting on how far the higher education sector has come in addressing racial inequalities and consider how much further it still needs to travel to make sure that our institutions are a truly equal space. Obviously, within the law faculty, this is part of the series of reflections we're having to mark Black History Month. We're very excited to have our speakers and our audience joining us today. Before I introduce you to the speakers, I wondered if I could please just run through a few minor housekeeping details about today's event. We'll be collecting questions for the speakers via the Q&A button at the bottom of your laptop and or mobile screens. Please send them to us during the event and we'll attempt to deal with as many as we can towards the end. Also, assuming there's time, we'll be very happy to take questions using the raised hand key live at the end. So please think about submitting a question via either mechanism and we will do our very best to deal with all of them. Please note that chat functionality has been disabled for this session. Therefore, you can only communicate with us via the Q&A button or window. We will also be recording the event, although probably not the Q&A part of it. Turning to our speakers, we have the great pleasure today of welcoming three very distinguished lawyers, two academics, one practitioner. Our practitioner who will speak first is Dr. Machilu Zimba, who is the policy advisor on race equality, religion and belief in this university's Equality and Diversity Unit. She leads on Oxford University's participation in the National Race Equality Charter, which provides a framework for critical analysis and for considering results in a comprehensive action plan to promote race equality within higher education institutions. So she plays a key practical role within this university. Secondly, Professor Iyiola Solanke is Chair of European Union Law and Social Justice at the University of Leeds Law School. She researches and teaches on EU law, discrimination law, race and law, and alternative dispute resolution. Her research interests fall within the fields of EU integration and racial integration. And her work has covered race and racism, discrimination more generally, intersectional discrimination, social movements, and the judiciary and governance within the EU. Her work on stigma and discrimination in particular is very highly regarded. Thirdly, Dr. Feluke Adibisi is Senior Lecturer at the Law School at Bristol University. Her scholarship focuses on decolonial thought in legal education. Her decolonial scholarship is pedagogical as well as jurisprudential and examines what happens at the intersection of legal education, law, society, and patterns of changing ideas of what it means to be human. Now, each of our speakers will make opening remarks, after which a conversation will follow between them. I will pose all of them some questions for discussion as between them, after which we will then have questions from members of the audience, which, as I say, should please be submitted either via Q&A or through the raised hand. The chat function is not working for the duration of this webinar. So I will now hand over to Machilu Zimba, who will be our first speaker today. Thank you.
So good afternoon, and thank you so much for your warm introduction and for all of you who've attended this afternoon. It's great to be part of this event celebrating Black History Month in the faculty. So as said, I am a policy advisor working on race equality in the university. And so the reflections I would like to share on the state of race equality in higher education are grounded primarily in my experience as a practitioner. As Nick mentioned, one of my responsibilities is to lead on the university's Race Equality Charter application. So the Race Equality Charter, or REC, is a national framework, and its aim is to improve the representation, progression, and success of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic staff and students in higher education. So as such, the REC does provide a framework that universities can use to identify and also critically reflect on the institutional barriers that are faced by BME staff and students. And so many of you at Oxford already know this, but Oxford University is one of the 15 institutions across the country that holds a REC award. This was achieved after almost about 5 years of extensive consultation with students and staff across the collegiate university. Now, the university's Equality and Diversity Committee, a high-level self-assessment team, then oversaw the process of developing an institutional action plan to advance race equality. Right now, we're in the process of reviewing the progress of our REC action plan, and we hope to renew our award in February 2022. So the reason I mention the REC is because I believe it crystallizes the progress that has been made, but also highlights what still needs to be done. So starting with some positives. Over the last 6 years, the REC has become instrumental in strategically putting race equality on the agendas of senior leadership teams in universities. It not only provides a practical framework to identify barriers BME people face, but ensures that institutions develop smart actions to address them. The REC process also ensures that there is a form of peer review in that a panel of E&D practitioners in other institutions assess applications and are empowered to recommend the giving or withholding of an award. Furthermore, accountability is also ensured through the award process, and that it requires institutions to measure and describe progress of their REC action plans. An institution that has not progressed faces the prospect of having their award revoked. So in all these ways, I feel as though the REC is a sign of and an aid to progress in the pursuit of race equality in higher education. The work process does, however, make visible the ongoing barriers that BME staff and students face, and many of you are familiar with these. The challenge of understanding what an anti-racist curriculum looks like, persistent award attainment gaps, few BME staff in senior roles across the board, so that's whether in professional and support roles or research and academic posts, and the lack of BME representation on decision-making bodies. Not to mention the prevailing racism and the need to ensure that BME people trust the mechanisms for reporting and dealing with racial discrimination. So these are all issues that universities are beginning to tackle. And the magnitude of the task is indicated in the fact that of the 15 institutions that have a REC award, all are at bronze level. So some progress has been made, in part motivated by the REC application process. And one of the ways which universities are addressing these issues is through the use of positive action measures to increase student access and participation. Oxford has for a number of years used interventions like our unique summer school for those wanting to apply to undergraduate programs, and now unique plus internships for those pursuing graduate studies in the sciences. There are also scholarships like our recently announced Black Academic Futures programs that are aimed at increasing the number of future Black academics. In short, and perhaps predictably, there is some cause of hope, but also lots still to be done. There is a framework for universities to think about race equality, and there are opportunities for the use of positive action to diversify our student body. Yet there remain many challenges. And so I want to close by highlighting 3. The diversification of our staff body, perhaps through the use of positive action measures. The racialized production of knowledge, and the need to establish race equality in academic publishing. As a university, we're faced with the difficult task of meeting local and national race equality challenges, but simultaneously maintaining a global perspective and also working towards becoming an international world-class university that we feel can truly be called anti-racist. So I think I'll pause at that moment and then and allow the others to speak.
Thank you very much, Machilu, for those fascinating comments. I now turn to Iyiola Solanke.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to Nick and Clara for the invitation and organisation of this event. So thank you, Machilu. You've already touched upon many of the topics I wanted to bring up in my first opening remarks, but I wanted to start really with a kind of broader approach, what I think is the broader approach that needs to be taken to tackling racism. And I've recently written about this in one of your journals at Oxford, where I talk about racism as a virus. So I draw the analogy between racism and a virus such as COVID-19. And I do that not to press the point, not to say that, you know, racism is in fact a virus, but just to really encourage us to think more broadly about what we mean when we're talking about racism and racial discrimination. It isn't something that's limited to one person, one place, or one policy. It's something that I think we now see because of the impact of COVID-19 in this country and in America, and also the Black Lives Matters movement. What we see is that this is something that is structural and systematic. And just as we tackle COVID-19 by taking action at many different levels, I think we need to think more carefully about ensuring that we address racism also in this way. So we need to take multi-level action, which is both within our universities, so the kind of policies that Machilu has just mentioned, but also outside of universities. And we also, I think, need to be more nuanced in our analysis of what racial discrimination is and what it looks like, in order to start to think more carefully about the different tools that are needed to tackle it, not just in terms of individual behaviour, but also in terms of addressing environmental factors, some of which Machilu again has kindly already mentioned, such as using positive action more effectively to ensure that institutions are taking more time to target the needs of the Black and minority ethnic students, as well as looking at where there are pockets of underrepresentation, and indeed also thinking about widening and improving participation. And that's where I think universities are doing quite well in terms of widening participation, but that has predominantly been the case at the undergraduate level. There is now an increase in awareness that the same needs to be done at the postgraduate level. So I was very happy to hear, Machilu, you mentioned the initiatives taken by Oxford under the remit of the positive action tools. But I'll say a bit more about positive action, perhaps later on during the discussion. The other point I wanted to make in this opening section is that our higher education institutions are a microcosm of society. So whatever happens in society will also happen on campus and vice versa. So when we talk about the state of race equality in higher education, we can't just bracket higher education off from the rest of society. You know, we don't want to tackle racism and racial discrimination on campus just for the sake of higher education, but because we also want to have an impact on racism on society, because, you know, we are training future leaders as academics, and so we need to ensure that when our students graduate, that they are aware of the fact that they are going to work in, maybe locally, but in more global environments. And that is one of the strongest reasons, I think, for taking a stronger and more effective and more intense interventions on racial inequality on campus. And as I just said, this needs to be multi-level, so not just at the undergraduate level, but looking at postgraduate level, looking at staff, both academic faculty and professional and support staff, We need to think about the curriculum, and I'm hoping that Foluke will say a bit more about that. But also we need to think about things like security and policing on campus and off. Let's not forget that the focus of the Black Lives Matter movements this summer was police brutality and police accountability. Many of our institutions will have security on staff who might indeed target more the Black and minority ethnic students on campus. So we need to take things like that seriously in order to tackle race equality in higher education. It's not all about scholarship, but as I said, it's also about the environment that we are creating for Black and minority ethnic staff on campus that not only gives them a sense of belonging, but is also empowering. And it would be difficult to empower and encourage students in the classroom, whilst in other areas on campus, they can still be made to feel as if they don't belong. And then the third area that I wanted to highlight in this introductory section was links to that really, and it's about the way in which our institutions tackle conduct and complaints. You might be aware of the report published by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission in 2018, I suppose that was now, looking at racial harassment on campus. That needs to be taken seriously. I think that our institutions are still not doing as well as they should be in relation to receiving complaints of racial harassment and discrimination, recording these, and also addressing those. And again, we need to look at that in a multi-level way. So not just in relation to racial harassment and discrimination amongst students, from other students or from staff, but also amongst faculty. So that's where I'll stop with my introductory remarks for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iyiola. And now we turn to Feluke Adibisi for her introductory remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Nick, for inviting me to speak and for the warm welcome. I'm really delighted to be speaking with Dr. Zimba and Professor Solanke during Black History Month. So I have been asked to give a brief outline of my thoughts on the state of racial equality in higher education. It is my opinion that a proper assessment requires looking beyond tick boxing and numbers-based diversity schemes that currently pervade higher education, because these schemes mostly serve to maintain and entrench the status quo. In the words of Angela Davis, it's a difference that doesn't actually make a difference. I think we need to take a closer look at who we are as universities and how we became who we are. So to make effective moves towards achieving racial equality in higher education, we need to reacquaint ourselves with the histories of our epistemologies and engage more honestly with the long history of scholarship on race and racism. We cannot begin to imagine the possibility of racial equality in higher education without a fundamental grounding in the entanglement between power, race, racism, epistemology, and the emergence of the so-called modern world. For example, Ruth Wilson Gilmore defines racism as the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. Michel Foucault defines racism functionally as primarily a way of introducing a break into the domain of life that is under power's control, the break between what must live and what must die. Thus, racism always operates in the realms of power. To this end, Aníbal Quijano, the Peruvian sociologist, conceptualized the colonial matrix of power, which was instituted at the inception of the modern world. The matrix covers 4 interrelated domains, one of which is control of subjectivity and knowledge. In other words, this domain covers questions of epistemology, education, and the formation of subjectivity. So the present so-called modern world and demarcations of subjectivity, according to Quijano, emerge from and are sustained by the colonial matrix of power. Therefore, there is an intimate connection between race and racism and the emergence of the world that we teach and we teach in, which Professor Solanke has mentioned. The world is connected to the university. By not reckoning with how our epistemologies are entangled in the enfoldment of race, racism, and the so-called modern world, a tri-temporal failure is evidenced in our current higher educational structures and our unfulfilled hope for racial equality. The first failure is evidenced in our treatment of the past, a failure to acknowledge how our disciplines produce the illusion of the ideal human, from which most of humanity was erased or cast beyond the abyssal line. We do not adequately engage with how the wretched of the earth, those cast into the zone of non-being, were placed there, and how our disciplines discipline the order of the world that we consider to be natural, inevitable. The second failure is in our treatment of the present, a failure to acknowledge that this epistemic creation, this world, and its present state are inextricably linked with what our disciplines did in the past. Our focus in higher education is then captured by a preoccupation with individual discrete acts of meanness that may or may not be racially motivated. We are tinkering around the edges while we ignore the colossal reproduction of racial formations as they shape and reshape our world to a dark future that seems inevitable and inescapable. The third failure looks to the future. Racialization has placed the world on the road to perdition. This epistemic creation we call reality cannot stand. Environmental degradation, global poverty, state violence, massive injustice will eventually tear this world apart. So we must ask ourselves in higher education, what world do we want to emerge on the other side of all this noise? Will our teaching, research, and higher education structure help or hinder it? Is there anything in what we do in higher education that can bring about worlds of freedom, real justice, balance, shared abundance, worlds woven in a new design? So this for me is the promise of decolonial thought. Well, I would say possible promise of decolonial thought in education. To borrow a quote from Harsha Walia, to have our lives determined by to have our lives determined by our dreams of a free world instead of reactions to a state-imposed reality is one of the most powerful tools of decolonization. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It is fascinating to make this journey from the practical to the theoretical, although the two are so thoroughly intermeshed in all of our three contributions today. Well, I wonder whether at this stage I could pose some general questions to each member of the panel to hopefully provoke a broader conversation about some of the key subject matters. I mean, the first very obvious question, I imagine, would be, in each of your views, and as things currently stand, what are the main barriers to further desirable change in higher education? In that regard, is race and colonialism a product of broader issues within the academy? Or are there equally distinctive factors which need to be considered?
So should I maybe kick off?
Please.
So thank you for that question. I think that one of the main barriers to change remains the reluctance to talk about race and racism, which has changed significantly this summer as a result of Black Lives Matter, and a lack of understanding of the toxicity of racism. And I think Foluke's contribution, which I really enjoyed, thank you for that, speaks to much of this. You know, the fact that discussion of racism is not only something that is not particularly developed in society, in our society in the UK as a whole, and is something that students are very rarely exposed to on campus, particularly, I would say, in law schools, perhaps slightly through the lens of human rights, But, you know, we don't have a developed range or recognition in law schools of programs such as race and law in the same way that we have disability in the law or gender in the law. And I think that situation has arisen because of a lack of willingness in society as a whole to really talk deeply and think deeply about the problem of race and racism. It's seen as, it's still to a large extent seen as something that affects the rotten egg, the one bad person, and around rather as something that is systemic and structural. As I said, that has changed, but only very recently, and we don't know how long this change will exist for. So that is something I would say is one of the main barriers to change. It's still seen as a taboo subject, and it's not seen as a subject that we want to put in front of our students at the undergraduate level or at the postgraduate level in the same way that we do with gender and disability, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I would completely agree with that. And I think that was one of the points I was actually going to make. But just to bring that even to the context of staff and what that would look like in staff relations, I think there may be an awareness of, you know, wanting to have policies or procedures or processes that are fair. But all of these policies and procedures and processes are enacted by human beings who may have racial bias. And so there is a lack of an understanding of what racial bias even looks like among ourselves, because we are afraid to speak about race, or even what we need to do to counter that racial bias. And I think we have made as a society, have made moves in terms of being able to identify gender bias and counter our own biases. But we have not necessarily done that with race.
Yeah, I think I would agree with what both speakers have said. I think there's a fundamental reluctance to do the work. So there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what race is, not even, you know, the connection between race and racism, but there's a fundamental misconception. And I think it's quite significant that this misconception and this unwillingness to do the work manifests itself in higher education, because we consider ourselves to be learned, right? This is our job. This is what we do, is that we research stuff. But we are really, really reluctant to research race. It's uncomfortable to do so. I accept it is uncomfortable to do so, but so are many other things. And I think to me, it confounds and continues to surprise me that in higher education, where we should be doing the research, be doing the work, we have really basic understanding. So, you know, you have conversations with academics who still think of race as biologically significant, where it's, you know, understood academically that it is socially constructed. So yeah, I would say, yeah, that confounds me massively.
And if I could just add one more thing to that, I think another barrier is also, again, looking beyond higher education, is also a limitation in society, in politics. So if we think about non-governmental organizations and the number of organizations that have a long track history in other areas, so in relation to gender or age, or sexuality even, the topic of race doesn't have that longevity in society. So it was really the Commission for Racial Equality that was the key body that would focus on racial equality across all aspects in society. We no longer have a Commission for Racial Equality. We have a highly put upon Equalities and Human Rights Commission, which does the best it can with the limited resources it has across all of the protected characteristics. And there aren't many organizations that have existed focusing on race for a period of decades. We have the Institution of Race Relations and we have the Runnymede, but that's really it. And that, I think, is also a barrier to change, because there is no long-standing, or I shouldn't say no, there are too few long-standing socio-political organizations that can help us to develop the conversation in the way that it needs to be developed.
Just linking that back to what we've also said about higher education, I've been thinking about what the role of higher education is in all of this, because we also, as Professor Solanke mentioned, we train, we educate students, and we're not educating perhaps to the point of enabling our graduates to be able to feed into the broader political and social discussions about race. And so what is the onus of the onus of the university? What is the university in terms of knowledge production and teaching? And those are two areas that I think we have not necessarily found a way to deal with race and racism.
Did any of you wish to add anything at this point? Or? Nope. Thank you. I mean, I think it's fascinating in those remarks that there is a concern specifically that race, in contrast with other prohibited grounds of discrimination, is falling short in the university environment. But that rather leads me to a second broad question, which is, how far do you each think that the law has helped in bringing about greater equality and or preventing discrimination in higher education? I mean, I'm thinking specifically here, given the remarks that each of you have made so far. Obviously, race was one of the earliest two grounds of discrimination which the law addressed, and yet the law is clearly still falling short in this regard. So, that being so, how far do you think the law has in fact been helpful to date?
I'm happy to go first again. Okay, I don't want to be jumping in and cutting off anybody's thunder, but yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because as you say, back in 1965 was the introduction of the first Race Relations Act, and it was the first anti-discrimination statute that was adopted in this country. Although it was a very symbolic act, as we know, it only covered discrimination in public places and didn't have any of the key concepts such as indirect discrimination, and didn't create any significant body for enforcement, which was only, the CRE was only created in 1976. So the role of law is a tricky one. Of course, the role of law has been important because it has enabled data to be collected. It has triggered some level of discussion within society, but I don't think that the law has been used as much as it could be. So, Machilu, you mentioned positive action. Those positive action provisions are underwhelmingly used across all institutions. And I think that's partly because there is confusion about what they are and how they can be used. And organizations are just terrified of being sued for reverse discrimination or positive discrimination. So positive discrimination, I think we would all agree, is unlawful. It's given a role or a position or a job to somebody who isn't qualified. That is positive discrimination, and that is unlawful. But positive action, which the law allows, is using a protected characteristic essentially as a form of merit in order to address a need, or to reverse underrepresentation, or to boost participation. And when that is done as part of a clear policy, then positive action is allowed. And we can use positive action so much more effectively to deal with what I mentioned earlier about the different levels of discrimination. We can use the positive action provisions to tackle more environmental issues, which go beyond finding the bad individual and punishing that individual. I think we can be a lot braver in the different ways in which we use positive action to bring about effective change, and those policies are already there. The other policy that we could think about using more is the public sector equality duty, which we know has been interpreted in a narrower way than perhaps is helpful by the courts, but nonetheless, those provisions are there. and you know, there are three aspects to the public sector equality duty. So again, we need to look more at what the law, at the tools that the law gives us, and use them in a smarter way to achieve the goals that we need to achieve, not just for higher education, but to bring about change in society as well.
Yes. And I believe we have, you know, universities have been doing quite a bit when it comes to positive action usage in access for undergraduate students, but that's not the same for graduate students. And I think you mentioned that, that was mentioned before. But I also wonder if positive action could be used for recruitment of staff. And again, there, a lot of, you know, there is a pushback of that sounding as though we're talking about affirmative action, when in fact, I believe that potentially it could be used as a tool that has nothing to do with affirmative action. But for instance, instead is looking for underrepresentation and pursuing that in our academic bodies, in our academic staff groups. So there could be simple measures like what we sometimes do with gender through recruitment, where you stop a recruitment process if you have no women who have been shortlisted through the process. You stop, pause, and look further to see if you could have minority ethnic staff or minority ethnic people shortlisted. So there are some ideas, and there are some ways in which we can try to use the law, use positive action, but people are hesitant. And I think that is because people are unaware of how it can effectively be used. The public sector equality duty could also do a lot more in terms of when university committees or decision-making bodies are thinking about equality issues. And so that is, it's an easy place where we can think about equality, but I'm not too sure if decision-making bodies take into consideration the public sector equality duty when they're making strategic decisions. And perhaps that is a space where we could, as practitioners, as academics, students, ask universities to focus on.
So may I just jump in at that point, because somebody in the audience has asked if the three of you could please explain the public sector equality duty. But I wonder if I could add to that, simply because this came up in a committee meeting I was part of yesterday. To what extent do you think the public sector equality duty is, from your experience, too often pushed into being a mere formality that we have on the agenda and refer to because it's on the agenda? And how far is it genuinely possible for us to give substantive consideration to it in a way which is both meaningful and effective? I don't know if anybody wants to. Please.
Solanke, do you want to come in? I'm conscious you haven't said anything here, but I'm happy.
No, it's fine. Okay,
all right. So to try to explain the public sector equality duty, and Nick, you might have to come in here as well. So the public sector equality duty requires public authorities and any private body that is providing a service on behalf of a public authority to give due regard to the need to promote good relations amongst groups that are protected under the Act, and to encourage participation. There are three strands to the public sector equality duty, and Nick, you might have to come in here and remind me of the other two. But the way in which it has been implemented, and this is perhaps due to the fact that interpretation was left primarily to the courts, has been to require organisations to conduct an impact assessment. So they have to look at the impact of their policies, new policies, policies that exist or policies that are being reviewed. They have to look at the impact of these policies on relations between groups who are protected by the Act and groups that are not. So it has to some extent become a tick box exercise, but it doesn't have to be that. You know, that isn't what the Act mandates. So it really does call upon decision makers, policy makers, to take a more substantive and long-term approach to the way in which they fulfill this duty. The courts have basically introduced a minimalist approach. So we can say that the courts have provided what they see as a basic level of satisfying this duty, and it is an obligation, it's a duty, but that doesn't mean institutions have to only satisfy, have to act in a way that satisfies the court. And the court has, as far as I'm aware, also said that it shouldn't be just a tick box exercise. Perhaps there just needs to be more training on it and more reflection on how it can be made a more substantive tool for tackling race equality. But at the moment, I think it is largely seen as a formality, because there is perhaps not enough discussion on what more can be done with the public sector equality duty.
Yes, I think that's right. Foluke, I'm conscious you haven't had a chance to speak. Would you like to?
Yes, definitely. I think, because I agree with Dr. Zimba and Professor Solanke about, you know, the good things that the law can be used to do that haven't been done yet. But I also think we should think about the limitations of the law, because I think there's a danger here, especially as, you know, legal academics and legal practitioners, to think, well, we just need the law to say this and then everything will be all right. But the law cannot make us do the research, cannot make us do the reading that we need, that we've said we need to do about what race is. Our current legislation and policies and regulations are based on our current state of ignorance about race and racism. So the law can only go so far. We still need to go back to this rethinking and acquainting ourselves with the origins of race and racism and how that has resulted in this modern world. And we also need to think about what the law, you know, that the law gives and the law takes away. Say, for example, stop and search is the example my students always give. Stop and search has been criticized, but that's the law. So the law is as, you know, similar to any other institution in which conversations about race are discussed. In higher education, there are things that higher education does well, and there are things it doesn't do well. And same thing with the law. There's things that the law does well in relation to racial equality, and there are things that the law isn't so great about when it comes to racial equality. So it's still left for us to do the hard work. And yeah, I think we just have to do the hard work, essentially, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that's some really important comments. The law really is a tool that can be used, but then we can also go beyond what the law mandates. I've just put in the chat, I've just found some paragraphs on the public sector equality duty, so you can have the participants can have an idea of the breadth of what it is and how much more broadly it can be used. Another limitation of the law, I think, is the fact that it does encourage us to think about protected characteristics in isolation. So even though we all recognize intersectional discrimination as something that makes sense, but in terms of our practice, it's quite difficult to operationalize intersectional discrimination because we still approach it through the lens of the separate strands as set out in the Equality Act. And that is a limitation because, you know, I write a lot about intersectional discrimination and think specifically in relation to Black women. That can also make it difficult to really address specific cohorts or where there is inequality. And anybody who knows my work knows that I'm not a supporter of universal intersectionality. Intersectionality should be used where it makes a difference and where it matters. But that is something where the current law doesn't actually support us in our aims of promoting equality in higher education.
May I ask, do you think that's a product of the very idea of legal categories that we have?
Yeah, I think it's a product of the way in which we've gone about creating our legal categories. So I think if we go back to looking at political conversations around the time of the development of the first Race Relations Act in 1965, there was a very clear reliance on this idea of immutability, that the law should be used, or discrimination laws should be used, to protect individuals when they are treated in a disadvantageous way because of characteristics that they haven't chosen. So at that time, the legislators were very clear that there should be protection from racial discrimination, but not discrimination on the grounds of religion, because religion was then seen very much as something that was chosen. So this idea of immutability really has informed the recognition of attributes that should be protected by anti-discrimination law. And I think that that needs to be reflected upon, and that needs to perhaps be changed, so that we aren't faced with just looking at biological categories. I mean, there's a lot about our laws that is biologically determined, but we look more at stigma. That's what I propose. We start to look at the social meaning that is given to attributes rather than the attributes themselves, because it's that social meaning that is used to dehumanize individuals, and then so place them in a position where discriminating against them is easy. And if we think about stigma, then we're not limited to thinking about individual characteristics. We can think about stigma in plural as double or triple or quadruple. But as I said, we need to think about, we shouldn't just dismiss single strand protection, but if we use the idea of stigma, we can develop single categories as well as, where it makes a difference, intersectional categories. So a long answer to your question is yes, I do think that the way in which we design categories has a lot to answer for.
Thank you, that's fascinating. What do our other panelists have?
Yeah, that's quite a lot to take in. I think I haven't really thought about this too much, but just to add, I think that I agree. It is, we need to start thinking about the social meaning that we attach to identities, and that is that will allow for other forms of intersectional discrimination to come into the fore. And just to say that there has been a move through Race Equality Charter applications to think about intersectionality, particularly in terms of gender and race. And we have been doing a lot of thinking about what that looks like here at the university, but also beyond gender, also thinking about religion and race. And so a few years ago, the PREVENT strategy came into play, and a number of our students were quite concerned that they could potentially be discriminated against on the basis of their religion. And a number of those students were students of color. And so we began to have to think about students of color and their religious identities, and how that was playing out on campus, how that was playing out in colleges, in the classroom, all in relation to the PREVENT strategy. But yeah, okay.
Yeah. I think those 2 points have been made really well. And I think the question itself, because I had to reflect quite a long time on that question, whether or not the categories themselves are problematic. And I think a lot of this arises from us not considering how those categories emerge. Say, for example, Professor Yeronke Oyewumi's research on the invention of women. So how gender roles, or how gender itself as a thing emerges. And if we ignore that sort of work in our creation of these legal categories, we're going to fall into these same traps of almost reproducing the same stigma that is inherent in the social production of those categories. And I think, for me, one of the reasons why this sort of conflation arises is because we try and silify our disciplines. So you do law, you don't need to know any sociology or history or philosophy. And I think that's dangerous, because then we produce people who reproduce the stigma, the discrimination that are almost inherent without actually being overt in the way in which we categorize people.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I'm aware that time is passing, and we have some questions from participants in the audience. So I hope maybe I can move on to one of these. This question is as follows. Once we get sufficient students of colour into higher education, what kinds of structures, processes, or safeguards are or should be in place to support them in spaces that are ultimately dominated by Eurocentric models of knowing? An example points that are made here are that plainly there's growing awareness of social, racial, and economic inequalities, for example, as a result of COVID-19, for example, as a result of protests over policing in the United States. So what does this growing awareness require of universities when it comes to changing support structures, for example, in relation to areas such as racial trauma and counselling? I don't know if anybody would like to.
That is a really difficult question, and there are quite a number of strands to that question. One thing I'd like to throw in the mix, I guess, is by just highlighting Oxford's Race and Resistance Network, and that is in our humanities department, but it's an interdisciplinary network and an interdisciplinary program. And that has acted as a program for a number of students and academics from across the university in different faculties or departments to have a space to intellectually engage with race equality issues from an interdisciplinary perspective. So in one sense, I think they are academic spaces where we can that we can provide for students and for other academics to discuss these issues, to debate these issues, to talk about these issues. So yeah, so there's an academic strand to that. But there also was a lot more on the idea of well-being and students feeling included. And one of our challenges here is the nature of our collegiate system, in that you may have students of color spread across the university, but there may only be a few in one college, and so they rarely have interactions with other students of color. And so, yeah, that is difficult to tackle. But again, there are ways in which we can have these students meet together, and our students themselves are very good at having societies that gather students of color together to ensure that they feel that they're not alone. But yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer. So I've just thrown out two ideas, and I'll allow the others to say more.
Thank you.
Yeah, it is a very difficult, multifaceted question, I think. I think looking at the nature of our universities, it strikes me that there's a difference between what universities can do, what universities will feel able to do, and what they should be doing. I would say let's start with what they should be doing. We should be rethinking the nature of what we're doing at universities. Because I think, like I said, in my introduction, we're tinkering around the edges. So we're saying, well, if you have racial trauma, we're going to cancel you or give you well-being lessons. And I'm like, well, why should they have racial trauma in the first place? Can we not imagine a situation where that doesn't occur? But that, of course, is limited by, when we talk about things like reading groups or support groups, in our the current state of universities, especially now, we're so much pressed for time that even to take the time out to mentor students who need mentoring, there's no time and there's no connection. There doesn't seem to be any connection in our minds between the fact that we are overworked and casualized and the persistence of racial trauma. So there's a bifurcation, fragmentation of the problems that pervade the neoliberal university. And also in terms of what the university feels it's able to do. The university management, and I'm generally not overly sympathetic to university management, but I will be slightly today. They are being torn in lots of directions. You have on the one hand the NSS, you have the funding model, and then you have university staff going on strike. How do you appease these very conflicting needs while you're trying to advance racial equality? So I do see that as something university management has to address. And ultimately, something has to give. You cannot serve many masters at the same time. Something has to give. And I think justice and equality should be, what we should chase, not the other things.
So just to add to those two brilliant interventions and maybe follow on from what Solanke said, I think this might just require universities to think about, reflect on what they're actually for. And this is something that's been mentioned earlier. And once they've decided what they are for, then they'll also think more about what it is that they need to value in the modern day, despite all the pull in, the tugs for attention in different directions. Universities have to think about what it is they value within the context of what universities are actually for in the 21st century. And if equality, diversity and inclusion is a central tenet of what universities are for, then that has to be centralized in everything that universities do. And then that has to be valued, that work has to be valued in the policies and the fora and the teaching that universities offer at all levels. So for example, things like work on decoloniality, decolonizing the curriculum, or work on mentoring, working closely with Black and minority ethnic students, all of that has to somehow be respected and reflected in workload allocations. So the model that we use for something as basic as workload allocation then has to be revised. So that's, I mean, it was such a broad question, and that's just looking at it really from the perspective of faculty. But there are many other things that universities will need to do if they take EDI as a central tenet of what the university is for in the 21st century.
Thank you. I'm aware that Machilu will have to leave us fairly shortly. She has another meeting. I have one final question, which is very specific. So I wonder possibly if it's appropriate to give specific responses to it, and then each person, starting with Machilu, can make some final remarks. The specific question is simply this. Given what has been said about the need for deeper reflection on what racial bias looks like, do the panel members think that works like Layla F. Saad's Me and White Supremacy and Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility are helpful resources for students and faculty members, or not?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of really useful resources, and those are just two. And just for anyone in Oxford who's listening, our University Bodleian Libraries has created an anti-racist reading list, and you can find that on our website. And I think that both those works occur on that list. So there are a number of individuals to read and to engage with. But just one thing I'd like to say on that is that I would like to draw more attention to authors in the UK as well. I think it's great to learn from the American context, but there is also a particularity to racism in the UK and its legacy and history that I feel we sometimes shy away from and quickly move on to what racism is like in the US. So I mention this just to say, yes, there's a lot to learn from, but just to urge those who are listening to look at what we already have in the UK and the literature and academic scholarship on racism in the UK as well, to inform their actions. I'll go off and just, mention 2 closing remarks. Thank you very much to both Dr. Adebisi and Professor Solanke for your thoughts. A lot that you have mentioned has caused me to reflect more on the role of the university in society, the role of our university in our little town, and the role of our university on the global on the global stage, and what that would look like in terms of our engagement with racism and race. So I've got to, I'll still ponder that. But also just thinking about the history of our epistemologies and how we engage with those. So how do we engage with a racialized category, the racialized creation of knowledge potentially. And that has to do a lot with curriculum reform and curriculum development. And I don't have any answers, but those are 2 things that I've drawn from our discussion that I think I'd call a number of our academics and students to critically engage with and think about, the nature and the role of the university and our production of knowledge and how that is impacted by racism. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to Dr. Machilu Zimba for your wonderful remarks today. I realize you have to leave us now. But
yes, apologies for that, but I'm going to have to just leave. But it's great to have been part of all of this.
Thank you so much for joining. Well, the other 2 speakers like to.
Go ahead, Foluke.
Okay, so to respond to the question about the books, whether they're good resources, I would say yes and no. Yes, well, let's start with no. No, because they're often taken in isolation. And I think that is slightly problematic. So in one of my classes, we actually read White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. So we just did read that on Tuesday, so yesterday, yeah. So, and we also read, White Fragility, and we also read a critique of white fragility. And one of the critiques was that Robin DiAngelo's book, while fantastic, doesn't take into account the field of Black studies, which is a massive and old, historied field of study. So this one of the problems with people trying to find like a primer on race and racism is that there's no one book that does it all. You have to keep on reading lots and lots of, stuff and keep on educating and re-educating, learning and unlearning. I have put in the chat box one of the reading lists that I collated on anti-racism materials and resources, and it's extremely long and it's not exhaustive. And as Dr. Zimba said, a lot of the times there's a lot of, because America is so big, there's a lot of reading from America. And we go, well, this doesn't apply here, therefore there's no racism in the UK. And I think that is in itself problematic. But the more you read, the more you see how these things, how these manifestations are interconnected. And I think my closing remarks are more questions rather than remarks. I think we should ask ourselves what work needs to be done and are we doing it? We should also ask ourselves how much justice is too much and why we're not doing the work we should be doing. And those are my closing questions, remarks.
Thank you very much indeed. That's a fantastic contribution.
Right, then I don't think I have anything really to add in relation to the books other than to really reiterate that it's almost too easy to rely upon literature coming from the United States. And we really do need to start focusing more on literature that speaks specifically to the British and European context. It's I actually studied languages as an undergraduate, so I spent a year in Germany, and I can still remember today the delight and the amazement when I realized that there are actually Black Germans, just as there are Black Brits, and there are Black Italians and Black French, and it just opened up my world. It made my whole understanding of myself in my context different all of a sudden. And I think we need to look more and teach our students more about race and racism in Europe from a European perspective, as well as, of course, from an American and an African perspective, thinking about South Africa. But yes, great books, but let's think more about books such as Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Remi Eddo-Lodge, for example. And my final comments, I suppose, just to, one thing I'll take away from this talk is, Foluke, your comments on thinking about the epistemologies, and yeah, just thinking more deeply about the philosophy of scholarship that we are pursuing in our universities, but also then to just repeat the need to look at racism as a virus, and so think about our interventions and initiatives on a multi-level basis, and to remember that universities are a microcosm of society, and that the work we do in universities has a broader impact and a longer term impact, and also just to again repeat the need to reflect upon the role of universities in the 21st century within the context of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matters.
Great, thank you. Well, are there any further questions? Well, if not, I wonder if I can thank our three speakers, Dr. Zimba, Professor Solanke, and Dr. Adebisi, for their really fascinating contributions today, which I think have made all of us think a lot more. There's a comment from a member of the audience, a faculty member, saying fascinating and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you, and I'm sure there is nobody who would dispute that point. So thank you for sparing the time to share your thoughts with us today, and for your contribution to the cause of equality generally. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.